Hello and welcome. Africa is often described as the forgotten continent by critics of U.S. policy, which adds all the more significance to the rare visit this week by U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Her trip is aimed at dealing with the several volatile conflicts that threaten to further destabilize the sub-Saharan region, an area plagued by wars, abject poverty, disease, and numerous refugee crises. In Somalia, tens of thousands have fled the capital since the latest outbreak of fighting there, and the country has collapsed to the point where the United Nations considers it too dangerous to even send in what is essentially a survey team for more peacekeeping forces. In the Horn of Africa, Eritrea and Ethiopia have massed troops on both sides of their disputed border. About 70,000 people died when these two countries went to war about 10 years ago, and the International Commission trying to resolve the conflict dissolved itself last week. Meanwhile, Washington is having a hard time convincing any African country to host the newly created African Command, AFRICOM, which remains in Germany for now. And today we'll discuss American diplomacy in Africa. And remember, we take your phone calls on this show. The numbers are there at the bottom of your screen. Well, joining me from the U.S. State Department is Dr. Jendayi Frazer, the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Madam Secretary, thank you very much for being with us. Good to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
I have to ask you first, Dr. Frazer, of course, there are those critics and the cynics about who look at U.S. policy in Africa as being a little patchy. What is the reason for Dr. Rice's visit right now? What would be the main thing she hopes to achieve?
Well, Secretary Rice is going to Addis Ababa to host a meeting of the heads of state from the Great Lakes region, Uganda, Rwanda, Congo, and Burundi. This is a mechanism, the Tripartite Plus, that the United States has had in place for the last few years, and it continues her engagement to help end the war between those countries that was raging in 1999. Secondly, she's going to hold a ministerial on Somalia to bring together the regional countries, since Somalia really is a threat to the entire Horn of Africa region, the stability of the Horn. And so we're going to have a consultation. She will also meet with the new Prime Minister to emphasize the need for political dialogue, inclusiveness, and to ensure that humanitarian assistance gets into the people of Somalia. She's also will hold a Sudan ministerial with the regional countries again, who are in many ways are guarantors of the comprehensive peace agreement that ended the 22-year civil war between the North and the South. The United States played a key role in that. This administration, President Bush, Condi Rice when she was National Security Advisor, and we will continue to try to get the CPA back on track. She will, of course, also have meetings with AU Chairman Konari, as well as the Prime Minister of Ethiopia and the Foreign Minister, Prime Minister Meles and Foreign Minister Seyum.
Well, ma'am, of course, the U.S. got its fingers burned in Somalia not that long ago, and of course the Darfur situation is one where the U.S. was criticized for lack of engagement, allowing virtually a genocide to take place. How hard is it going to be to build confidence now at this stage?
Well, it's very clear that the United States has been actively engaged in Africa, more so than any previous administration. President Bush has already put $6 billion into Africa in this last year. And so I don't think that the problem is U.S. credibility in Africa. We did not, in fact, get our fingers burnt in Darfur. We are the major contributor of humanitarian assistance. We've helped airlift in the African Union forces that are there now, and we are the country that has built all of the camps for Darfur. And so our engagement has been consistent. It's been for the last 7 years, and so we don't have a deficit of credibility.
Sorry, ma'am, I was referring to U.S. involvement in Somalia specifically when I talked about fingers getting burned. But I have to ask you one thing. The HIV/AIDS, of course, is a concern for the region, and the Secretary of State is visiting as there is discussion of the U.S. President's emergency plan of AIDS relief, PEPFAR, if the abbreviation's right, based on largely on encouraging a policy of abstinence among young people and using condoms only for high-risk groups. Now, that's not gone down that well with many in Africa, and I wonder what is the U.S. Secretary of State going to do to address that?
Well, it is going down well with many in Africa, because in 2000 we were spending about $300 million on global HIV and AIDS around the world. Today, President Bush put $15 billion in his program. He's asked for another $15 billion. And in 2001, when Secretary Powell went to Africa, there were about 50,000 people on antiretroviral treatment. There are now more than 1 million people on antiretroviral treatment, primarily because of President Bush's emergency plan for AIDS relief. And so the notion that somehow it's simply about abstinence, I think, is absolutely wrong. We, in fact, adopted what has proven to be successful in Uganda, the abstinence, be faithful, use condoms, ABC. So we've spent plenty of resources on all three areas, and the focus has been, of course, getting treatment so that you can extend people's lives.
We had an email that came in, if I could put this to you. It came from Helen in Connecticut, and she says, the PEPFAR program requires its grantees to sign an anti-prostitution pledge that many AIDS groups working with the most vulnerable women claim is obstructing their programs. The government of Brazil even refused $40 million in the US funding because of the pledge, and a number of NGOs have gone to court claiming that the pledge is an unconstitutional violation of the right to free speech. So what's the point of it?
Well, I can't speak to that pledge in particular. I think that the idea here is to try to use the resources for PEPFAR for the purposes that it was intended, which is to provide treatment, to provide care, and to prevent the disease through AIDS education, testing, and other areas. And so I don't know what the specifics are of that pledge. I do know the Mexico City agreement was, an exception was made for the PEPFAR program. So I'm not sure about that particular pledge that the person in Connecticut is speaking of, but I do know that many countries, I was the former ambassador to South Africa, U.S. ambassador to South Africa, and we reach out to numerous partners to try to make sure that it's community-based and the programs are being effective and are reaching the maximum number of people. And I'm sure that that would include commercial sex workers as well.
Dr. Frazer, I'm wondering how you and Dr. Rice have been addressing another issue that's obviously quite high on the agenda, the positioning of the African Command, AFRICOM. You have the issue of Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, other countries having a rather negative approach to it. They don't seem to want to host AFRICOM there. What options do you have, and what's being done on that front?
Well, we've never asked Nigeria, Kenya, or South Africa to host AFRICOM, and so it's hard for a country to reject something that they've never even been asked to host. We have, in fact, had some countries who've come forward and asked to host AFRICOM, but the decision-making about whether we will have a headquarters in Africa and where that headquarters are bent is still under discussion in the United States. So it's a bit premature for countries to be rejecting, and I don't think that really many have. When we went back to the South Africans, we understood that, in fact, they haven't made a decision about whether to host or not host AFRICOM. Again, we never asked them to do so. The same with Nigeria. We've gone to Nigeria. I was just there with the Deputy Secretary. We had discussions with the Minister of Defense as well as the President, and AFRICOM, of course, came up, but not in the context of either us asking them nor their offering or rejecting to host it. So I think that this media notion that countries are rejecting AFRICOM is a bit overblown.
We had an email that came in, if I may put this to you, from David in Virginia here in the USA. David wrote in saying, with the new US plan for AFRICOM, the US will establish permanent military bases in Africa. South Africa is opposed to this move, and the US groups such as Trans-Africa have criticized it as well. How will this presence further African sovereignty and democracy?
Well, it's very clear. Let's just be clear, though, that we already have a base in Africa. It's called the Combined Joint Task Force Africa, Horn of Africa. So we're already there. But how will it serve African countries? We are the primary trainer of African peacekeeping forces today, and African peacekeeping forces are the most deployed across the continent. And so we clearly have a role to play, and we'll continue whether there's an AFRICOM or not. We've been training these African forces, and that well-trained forces that respect human rights do nothing but contribute to the sovereignty of their countries. It's extremely important. This is part of the problem of Eastern Congo today, which is the Congolese armed forces have not had complete control over their territory, and therefore these various rebel groups from other countries are residing there, terrorizing the local population, and that's the huge challenge that we have in Eastern Congo that the Secretary will discuss when she goes to Addis on the 5th of December.
Ma'am, we have a caller on the line. Richard McKinsey is on the line from London. Richard, what would you like to ask?
Hello, Riz. Good evening to you.
Good evening. Please go ahead with your question.
Yes, I would just like to ask a very brief question to your guest on the show. She's a black woman. I heard her saying that America spent, or George Bush or President Bush last year spent $6 million on AIDS in Africa. If she's proud of America spending only $6 million in the entire 53 countries in Africa on aid, where we know how much America spends around the world on other things.
I'm sure the figure wasn't $6 million, Richard. Madam Secretary, if you could just clarify that, the amount America has been spending.
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry, he got their number wrong. I said $6 billion last year for our development assistance, humanitarian assistance, but the program on HIV/AIDS is $15 billion, and the president has asked for another $15 billion. And I'm very proud of this number because in 2000, before President Bush came into office, as I said, the United States was only spending $300 million for world AIDS around the globe, not Africa, but around the globe. And so, yes, I'm very proud of $15 billion under this administration and the request for an additional $15 billion. And I'm more proud of the fact that more than 1 million people are now on treatment when only 50,000 were on treatment in 2000. So yes, I'm very proud of the numbers. I think we can do more. Not just the United States, but African governments, international organizations, and other governments. Yes, there's obviously more that can be done.
We've talked about the risk to stability in the Horn of Africa region, and we had an email that had come in from Kenya, from Nairobi in Kenya, and Mohammed Nyamwanda from Nairobi says the TFG, the Transitional Federal Government in Somalia, and the Ethiopian government are some of the most oppressive regimes, yet the US backs them because they are against Islam. This is hypocritical, to say the least, and it will lead to defeat. It's just a question of when. Of course, I mean, that's his view on that, but I wonder what faith the US has in the TFG in Somalia and the current involvement of Ethiopia.
Well, we certainly believe that the Transitional Federal Government needs a lot more capacity. We certainly believe that the Transitional Federal Government has to become far more inclusive to be legitimate, and we welcome the appointment of the new Prime Minister, who we hope will be able to reach out broadly to the various stakeholders in Somalia. It can't be true that we are against Islam because we back the Transitional Federal Government, since the charter of the Transitional Federal Institutions recognizes Sharia. The majority, if not 99% of the people, including those in the Transitional Federal Government, are Muslim. So it doesn't make any sense, the notion that by supporting the TFG we're anti-Islam, which of course the United States is not. As far as Somalia and Ethiopia, we're calling on all parties to protect the civilians, because there is indeed this war taking place in Mogadishu, and it's the responsibility of the Transitional Federal Government, the Ethiopian forces, and others to try to limit the impact of that on civilians, which has been just devastating.
What about the risk of Ethiopia and Eritrea now rising back up into conflict, considering their border dispute? That seemed to have settled, but again, it seems to be very much on the cards. There may be more conflict there.
Well, we're always concerned about rising tension on the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia because of the lack of demarcation of that border. We've called for both parties to exercise maximum restraint. Eritrea, of course, has gone back in a temporary security zone, and Ethiopia has deployed more forces toward its border, but it's not in either country's interest to go back to war. So I don't have any expectation that they would actually do so, because it's not in the interest of either, but we do need to get the border demarcated. We had
an email, and I'll get into that in just a second, but I want to bring up something that I know you've had had to address before, and it's the infamous page 347 of your former U.S. Ambassador John Bolton's book, Surrender is Not an Option, where he raises the issue of your involvement, he says, in supporting Ethiopia in perhaps going back on the agreement that was reached by the EEBC. Now, this is what Ambassador Bolton had to say when he was on the show just 2 weeks ago with us.
So when Assistant Secretary Frazer shifted her position, which it was within her responsibility as Assistant Secretary for Africa, it undercut the argument why we were in the Security Council in the first place. And I still don't know the answer to the question, but I do know that the standoff over that border continues to this day.
Now, Dr. Frazer, what of course he's referring to is saying that you had decided to say that there should be a reconsideration of that decision reached by the EBC, saying that certain bits of borderland were to go to Ethiopia and certain to Eritrea, saying that there's some land in dispute that should have gone to Ethiopia. And I would like to get your response to that first.
Well, thank you. And actually, this is the first I've heard John Bolton speak on it, and I haven't had a chance to read his book, but I can say unequivocally that he got it wrong. I never shifted any of U.S. government policy or my own position about the delimitation line. The EEBC drew a delimitation line. Both parties agreed that it would be final and binding, and that has always been the U.S. government's policy. And so I never shifted any official policy. It's always been our policy, and I don't understand really where Bolton got the idea that somehow I had shifted our policy. What we said is that to demarcate that border, let's accept the delimitation line as final and binding as it is. Both parties agreed to that. We need to now move towards demarcation, and in demarcation, we need to find a way to deal with some dialogue between the two countries because it affects the local communities on that border. In fact, that delimitation line gives land that belonged to Eritrea to Ethiopia, land that had previously been considered Ethiopia to Eritrea. That's fine. They both agreed final and binding. But we've now still stuck with how do we get the border demarcated, and I can't see a way ahead except that the two countries themselves come forward in dialogue to demarcate the border. So I'm sorry to say, but Ambassador Bolton is either misinformed about that, and I can imagine maybe someone told him that, but he certainly never got that from me.
Just let you know, ma'am, we did call Ambassador Bolton's office to confirm that or clarify, and he says he stands by that statement. But I want to put an email to you quickly as we have only about 40 seconds or so to go. Ida in Florida wrote in saying a judicial body sitting at The Hague rendered a legally binding verdict agreed upon by both Eritrea and Ethiopia in the Algiers Peace Treaty in 2000. Isn't your call for a dialogue between the two nations cynical at best and destructive at worst? Just a quick response, please, ma'am.
No, I think that the Boundary Commission has done a delimitation. How are you going to get the border demarcated without dialogue between the countries and the population itself? That is placing the pillars in the ground, and you have to do that with some discussion between the two countries where the pillars are going to be placed. I don't see a practical way around it, and I'm not the only one who is saying this. The UN and others have also called for dialogue between the parties. They tried to bring them together within the context of the EEBC. And we helped to bring Ethiopia back to that table, at which point Eritrea walked away.
Well, ma'am, I have to thank you very much for joining us and taking this discussion. Good luck with your plans for Africa, and we'll speak to you again soon, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that's it. Emails to riz@aljazeera.net, and Street Talk is coming up next.